of the things about our show is it's going to be unique.
You are what you do. You can say any amount of things that you want to say, but what you do is what everybody sees.
People were like, oh, I'm just going to JV it. Like, it's just JV it. Like, what the hell does that mean?
I cannot tell you how excited I am to hang out with you guys today, so thank you so much.
Well, then that end buyer could come back and say, well, I didn't fully understand that it was subject to.
That's not a thing. Like, the SEC has thought of all of these things. They've been here since 1932.
And you can do what you want with your property.
Buyers have time, they have negotiating power, they have options.
Oh my gosh, I am blown away by your inexperience, and they've been in business 20 years.
And that includes things other people put on your property, right? It's your property to be okay. Suddenly, cousin Jimmy's in a lawsuit.
A novation is replacing one contract or one obligation with another.
Out with the old, in with the new.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the INRIM podcast. Today's topic is the ins and outs of working with transaction coordinators. I'm Sean St. Clair, and I'm going to be your host today. You may notice that it's just me. Andy Fowler is not with us today, so I'm solo. He's taking some well-deserved time off. He'll be back next week, so I probably won't be as smooth as Andy, but I'm going to do my best to get us through this episode. If you're new to the show, give us a like and make sure to subscribe to our channel. We want your feedback. Leave us a comment. Go to our Facebook page, our YouTube. Subscribe. Give us a like. It helps us provide better content to you. So today I wanted to talk a little bit before we get into our episode of a change in a law in Virginia. So this will be my legal update for the day. It's basically a law that has been passed in Virginia that goes into effect in July, which basically requires that real estate wholesalers be licensed as real estate agents within Virginia. Basically, what the law states is that the definition of a real estate broker now includes anyone who negotiates or otherwise deals in real estate contracts, including assignable contracts on 2 or more occasions in any 12-month period for compensation or valuable consideration. So basically, you're allowed to wholesale 2 transactions in Virginia per year without a real estate license. But if you're going to basically receive consideration or compensation for the assignment of more than 2 contracts in any 12-month period in Virginia, you will have to have a real estate license and comply with all of the real estate laws as far as how compensation is paid and how commission is paid. Generally it will have to go through your broker and the whole thing. So in Virginia, they've changed things up a bit. Wholesaling now requires that whoever is the principal in the transaction and receiving compensation or consideration as a result of the wholesale transaction, that they must have a real estate license. So be aware of that. This has happened in other states, so this isn't something that's new, and we're probably going to see different regulations going on as time goes, as the way people invest in real estate, buy real estate, as that changes over time. We're going to see these new regulations. So this is one of them. And I'm sure that those investing in Virginia are going to adapt and overcome. But just be aware that if you're going to do 2 or more wholesale transactions there, starting in July, you'll have to have a real estate license. So today at 2:00, we're going to have our Creative Finance Collective. So we do this every Tuesday at 2:00 Arizona time. So that would be 4:00 Central time. And basically what the Creative Finance Collective is a group of attorneys who basically gather together every Tuesday online and discuss all things real estate, primarily creative financing. And then our audience can ask us questions. We do a little bit of talking amongst ourselves, but frankly, we answer questions pretty much for the whole hour. So if you have questions, feel free to show up today at 2:00 Arizona time. It's on our INRIM YouTube page. It's on our INRIM Facebook page. Just go there. You'll see the event scheduled. and log on at 2:00 and participate, ask questions, etc. Then today during our show, we reserved the last 15 minutes to respond to questions regarding what we've discussed on the show today. So if you have questions regarding how to use and work with transaction coordinators, by all means, post them. We'll be monitoring the chat, and then we will ask those questions during the last 15 minutes of the show. So let's basically get into the show. So today our topic is the ins and outs of working with a transaction coordinator, and we're joined by Molly Tennant. Molly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we get into the topic, let's just go through, and talk about, the different things that you do within the real estate community. So first is you're the Chief Operations Officer for Pace Mory. Tell us a little bit about your role for Pace. What do you do for his company and organizations?
Oh man, I mean, that is a loaded question, right? At the end of the day, I do anything and everything. If anybody here has ever been an operator, they know that you wear a lot of hats, right? Operating a business in general, let alone multiple businesses like it is with Pace, is a lot, right? There's a lot of roles to fill. There's a lot of things to do. And so on a day-to-day basis, I'm doing anything from accounting, talking to our accounting team and making sure things with accounting are going well, to overseeing portfolio management with our asset managers and our acquisitions team. I also run an entire team of transaction coordinators, which we'll get into that. And I have, of course, a transaction coordination course with Pace Mory called TopTier TC. So I am really sitting in a role of overseeing multiple different organizations, from TC work to asset management to we have some fund-of-fund opportunities and syndications that we've done, as well as new acquisitions and other random businesses that Pace brings up, but usually they don't have anything to do with what I do day to day. So I try and just handle things as they come. I like to think of my role as the catch-all. So somebody who basically catches all of the ideas from the visionary. Some of you may know the visionary and the integrator. I'm the integrator in our team. I catch all of the ideas that the visionary brings and I decide what to do with them. Do I put them down and say, hey, this isn't a good time for us to take this on right now? Or do I hand them off to a team member and delegate that off? Or do I take on the challenge myself and head off and maybe a new business endeavor or a new joint venture opportunity that we're going to do with someone else or another team? And so it's mainly a lot of what I'm doing. Within this new course that we have for TopTier TC, we have, I think, 500, somewhere between 500 and 550 students right now. Many of them have no real estate background. And a lot of this started because Pace has his own mentorship, which many of you know, which is subto. And there's a lot of investors coming out of that mentorship that need some additional hands, whether it's just an assistant to help with things. And that's really what a TC does a lot of times, is assist with their transactions and many other things within their business. But somebody to basically be the eyes and ears for the transaction and make sure things go smoothly. And that's really what I'm focused on and what I have been focused on for about the last year or so. I see many of my students in the comments. So we are a big, happy family. It's really been a good addition from Pace's subto mentorship. So we have a collective amount of communities. It's great to have a good group of people that are really trying to do good and do well for themselves and try to make this industry better as a whole, just like you do, Sean. I mean, really, you're basically just trying to make this investment industry better as a whole, Well,
I appreciate that. So tell us a little bit more about TopTier TC. It's a training program, and I will tell you, I've worked with a number of TopTier TCs or trained TCs, and working with them is fantastic. They really understand the transaction, especially creative finance, and the process of interacting with the other professionals. They know when to reach out to us, when to figure things out on their own, that type of thing, which is huge. But tell us a little bit about what that training looks like, what's involved in the training, that type of thing.
So we have two versions of the course. We have a cash transaction. So basically, if anybody wanted to learn how to maybe be a TC for traditional cash transactions, maybe wholesalers that are just doing traditional cash transactions, maybe not in Virginia. Just kidding, because you just brought up Virginia.
Yeah.
But yes,
Yeah.
those are things
Right.
we navigate as TCs. Is like, hey, have you talked to an attorney about, is this legal to do here, right? Are you past your 2 transactions in this state? That kind of thing. And these are things that we keep up with within Top Tier, right? And so I love always hearing your guys' updates or updates from my students when they run into those things, right? Like, hey, I ran into an attorney that said we can't do this. Great, let's do an update, right? So the course itself has 2 sections. Like I said, it has a cash section for people who are just trying to dip their toe in and see what transaction coordination is about in general. Mainly people doing traditional cash or like finance TC work are usually going to be real estate agents within another brokerage. So me being a traditional agent, I've been licensed since 2015. I didn't ever use a transaction coordinator, but I probably had the option to. I'm sure there was another agent at my office that was designated to doing TC work, and they would make, a little bit of money from doing that, but it would all be broken up within the brokerage and everyone would be licensed in that transaction. Now, coming into Pace's world, I was like, this is a little bit crazy. And there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of people who don't have real estate licenses or they don't have any real estate background in general. And so they just don't know. And kind of sort of what you just said, Sean, they don't know when they're crossing boundaries with attorneys, like how often is too often to reach out to an attorney, and what is too far to ask, and what is something that I shouldn't be saying or asking, and where is my boundary, right? Is something that I felt like a lot of these investors in Pace's courses or in Pace's world, Pace too, right? That they just didn't necessarily feel like, for me, they didn't have the boundaries that I felt comfortable working in. So I wanted to create some boundaries, which is where the creative side of the course comes in, where I teach people how to transaction coordinate for creative transactions specifically. So I teach people creative finance in a way. I don't teach acquisitions, lead management, or any of like the disposition strategies, but I do teach how to handle a transaction from start to finish and what to do when you run into certain scenarios. When's the appropriate time to reach out to an attorney? What's appropriate to ask a title company to help with? And what can you do as a transaction coordinator to sort of mitigate things that you run into, where maybe you could mediate problems without an attorney involved and figure out how to deal with it, and then come to the attorney and be like, this is what we've decided on. Can you draft these documents? Not come to the attorney before that. So you have, a bunch of work that the attorney needs to do that they probably weren't expecting to do to close this transaction.
Yeah, exactly.
So lots of stuff like that.
So let's talk a little bit, because we've already, started talking about the different roles and things. And we've talked about this. One of my biggest pet peeves is on social media. I will see somebody post in, a different Facebook group or something like that, where they'll say, hey, I need an attorney for this state, or I need legal advice here. And next thing I know, I'm seeing the comments and all these people are saying, oh, talk to this TC, or even sometimes the TCs themselves jump in and like, oh, I can help you. I'm thinking, well, you're not an attorney. They're asking for an attorney. They're not asking for a transaction coordinator. So just getting down to the basics, how would you define a transaction coordinator?
So for me, a transaction coordinator, the role of a transaction coordinator came from working in traditional real estate, right? So let's think of this from the perspective of a traditional real estate transaction. An agent would go out, they would work with a client, whether it was a buyer or a seller, and they would get their contracts executed, whether they're on the buyer or the seller side. And then they would come back to their brokerage and say, hey, I need someone to babysit this. I basically call them the nannies of the transaction. I need someone to babysit this, right? Like for me as a nanny, I didn't make the child, and I'm not going to be responsible for taking care of the child forever. I just need to watch it and make sure it doesn't die. Just take care of it, feed it, keep it along, make it happy. Everything's good, right? So that's the role of a TC in traditional real estate and in investor real estate, right? In the difference between traditional and investor is in traditional real estate, that person usually has a license. Whoever's the transaction coordinator has a license. So they can sometimes execute documents on behalf of their agent partner that's working with them in their same brokerage. That's typically how the relationship goes. So I had to figure out this careful balance coming into Pace's world and teaching people how to TC, and that like, okay, yes, and I even have people now that'll come to me like, hey, if I used my TC at my brokerage, they would do all this stuff for me. And I'm like, that's great. But what you're not understanding is that you're working with somebody who's not licensed in your state. They don't work with your brokerage. They're not covered by your errors and omissions insurance. They're not in this transaction the same way, they're now a third party, which could look like hiring them as legal counsel to draft legal documentation for a transaction. And nobody wants to cross that boundary. So I'm going to need you to handle your stuff, right? Because it's your kid in this case. And I will watch it and oversee it. And I will make sure I take care of everything I can without bothering you. But I'm not going to do that. Now, the issue becomes, and this is what you just brought up, that we know too much, right? We get involved in all these transactions all across the country. And we see the responses from attorneys multiple times over and over and over again. And so we know the answers potentially.
Right.
And so people think that TCs have all the answers and that they can just give them all the answers and they can suggest what documents to use and they can draft those documents and do all of those things. But what's really hard about it for me is that, you know, now I have to change that narrative because I'm coming in sort of after the fact of that, Sean. And I have to sit here and say, well, as much as that is true, that a TC might know that information legally, and from an insurance perspective, they are not insured or licensed to do those things. And you're putting both of you at risk by asking a TC to do those things. And so when you put it from that perspective, I think sometimes people think I'm being dramatic, but other times people are like, oh, okay, I see. It's just like you wouldn't go ask your chiropractor to perform a surgery on you just because they're a doctor. You know what I mean? Like there's different licenses and there's different understandings. Yes, maybe the chiropractor understands how the surgery would work, but they are not the person that would perform the surgery. Just like a TC may understand how the documents should work. They may understand what documents would be needed, but that conversation needs to happen with an attorney. So I agree with hiring a TC, of course. I mean, I would never not condone hiring a TC because it's going to help you scale and grow, and it's going to help you have extra sets of educated eyes and to a certain extent. But I would like the perspective to be, hey, I'm a TC and I do have an attorney in this state that I've worked with before. If you would want to hire me to help with your transaction, I can make that introduction. Or if you're not looking to hire a TC, I might be able to make that introduction as well. But I know that sometimes, like in Sean's case, you guys, to self-perform here in Arizona, he wants to only work with my team, you know, because that's just been his experience and that's what helps him do business better. So for me, it's like, hey, I may want to introduce somebody to Sean for a self-performed transaction, but Sean will want me or my team involved. And so I could make a comment when someone's asking for legal advice and say, absolutely, I have an attorney. Then I could go back to Sean, explain the situation and say, hey, I've seen other transactions be done like this. What do you think? But we have an educated conversation and the final decision comes between the client and Sean, not me.
Right. And I don't in any way want to diminish the role of a transaction coordinator. In fact, you know, for the work that we do with self-performing, we need transaction coordinators. We do not, you know, it's way more expensive and way more handholding if we're working with buyers and sellers directly. You need properly trained transaction coordinators, and they make the world of difference. I mean, it no doubt. So with that said, and knowing that they add so much value, in my view, to the transaction, why don't you talk about what are the benefits of having a transaction coordinator involved?
Yeah. So from my perspective, you guys, and I didn't even recognize this, when I came into Pace's world, I really got hired as an operator for his wholesale business. I don't know if you even know this story, Sean, but quickly after I got hired, we shut that whole operation down because I was like, why are you even wholesaling still? And not only that, like, this isn't the market to be doing it in, and I'm not probably the best person. So if you want to keep me on your team, which it didn't really matter to me at that point, if you want to keep me on your team, this is probably not the right role, you know? So I actually stepped away from operating the wholesale business to really doing more of a transaction coordinator role without being hired as a transaction coordinator. Now, I did have operations aspects to me where I was seeing it from a whole perspective, not just the transaction coordinator role, but it really gave me a lot of insight into where there were missing checks and balances and where there were missing processes that an investor or a visionary profile doesn't naturally have the inclination to understand, right? They just don't, they want to go out and get the deals and be like, boom, 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 done, 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 done. They get the contract and they think they can throw it to their title company and that everything's just going to go. And now I will say, on very rare occasions, title companies or even attorneys will run and they will take the transaction and they will draft addendums for you. They will do all kinds of stuff that normally that's not normal, right? But I have also seen the opposite more often, which is that you burn out the attorneys. Like Sean only wants to work with us a lot of times because he would get burnt out, right? You burn out the attorneys and you burn out the title companies you're working with. And the next thing you know, we have title companies or closing attorneys saying, we no longer work with investors. We only work with licensed agents. We don't want to do investor transactions anymore. And so that's one of the biggest things that I think I've seen that a transaction coordinator can help mitigate. We can help keep these relationships good. And it's almost like we speak the language that both people speak. We speak investor and we speak title company or attorney. And so we can bridge that gap between chaos and very organized and create systems and processes in between that help streamline the processes for both sides and create a happy place for everyone to continue to do these transactions and really help create a viable working space to continue the investment industry so that we don't continue to see heavy regulations come down the pipeline. I don't expect that we won't continue to see that. Obviously, you just talked about Virginia. Right. I think we'll continue to see regulations on wholesaling and on investments, investors in general. But if I can bring anything to this world with this 550 group of students I have, I feel like I'm creating little me's to go out there and just help keep this industry a little bit more viable, you know?
And speaking of the trained TCs, so, you know, you have a group that you've trained or are in the process of training. If I'm an investor and I'm looking to kind of get started and I'm ready, willing, and able to employ a TC, there's tons of people out there in the investor community that say I'm a TC. What are the things that you would look for to determine what TC to hire? You know, what are some questions you might ask, research you might do to figure out who should I hire that's going to be able to handle this transaction?
Yeah. This is such a great question because I think a lot of people will say, well, you know, you have TCs that are graduating, but they don't have any previous experience. So why would I want to hire them? Right. And that is something that my students struggle with and anybody struggles with, right? When you first start out, people are going to be like, no, I want to use the most experienced TCs out there. But what I will say is that my team and myself probably can't take on as many transactions as somebody who is newer. And I'm going to be more inclined to run transactions the way I want to run them versus when you hire a new TC, they have all the basics. They have all the bases and they have a community of people, including myself and weekly Q&As with me to ask all the questions they need if they run into something they don't understand or know how to do. So when you're interviewing somebody new, I want the investors that are out there to understand that it's not necessarily always about how heavy of experience they have, because you can also get into a relationship where you're like, this is how I want things to be done. And that person may be more inclined to do that because they're just starting out. And so you can create this customized relationship from the very beginning, and they're going to be more available, right? They're going to be much more likely to answer the phone, much more likely to answer your emails. They'll be much quicker to answer for you, and you'll have a better experience. I've seen many investors say, hey, I worked with this super well-known TC company and I just wasn't happy, right? I didn't get the experience I wanted because they wanted more attention than what they got. And so those people might need to consider hiring somebody with a little bit less experience. They still have the training from TopTier TC. They still have access to me. They have access to 4 different coaches within the community. They have multiple Q&As a week. And so there really isn't a question that can't be answered. And if there is a question that can't be answered, guess what I do? I go and I spend the money to reach out to Sean to figure the question out, right? And if Sean doesn't know it, we may reach out to a different attorney in a different state and we'll figure it out. So that's the best thing about the community. It is a place for people to come and not only learn the basics that I teach them in the pre-recorded content, but continue to learn in the day-to-day Q&As and the day-to-day update Zooms. I mean, you and I just did an update Zoom. We'll do one tomorrow again. Those of you that are my students, we have another one coming up tomorrow. So we constantly do educational Zooms on changes, on updates to documentation that we've seen people using and how they're using it, how they're inappropriately using it, whatever it may be. And so when you're hiring a TC for yourself, it should be more about, and Kimmy's right, the figure it out button. It should be finding somebody that has that figure it out button. Are they willing to drive and ask the right questions and figure out the things that they don't know for your business specifically? Then they're probably the right person. If they want you to just hand them the thing and they don't want to, interact with you too much, then maybe you're not the right fit for each other. But you're interviewing somebody the same as you would sort of if you were on a date, right? Do you like each other? Do you want to work together? Yeah. Do they have training under their belt? Do they have access to resources? Yeah. So it's more so about whether you guys mesh together and whether you feel like that person has the drive to get the job done than it is about how many files they have actually done.
And that personality meshing is so important because there's a lot of good professionals, good investors who have different personality types, right? And so, you could be a B type personality and work great with an A type person. And that's maybe the type of transaction coordinator you need, as opposed to, maybe an A type investor would prefer a little more laid back transaction coordinator, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's figuring out who you work with. Both sides are just as capable, but for some reason they can't get along because their personalities don't mesh. So, in addition to experience and training and, competency, it's also figuring out if those personalities mesh as well. So that's a great point. So what about warning signs though? So you mentioned you've had investors who have said, yeah, I worked with this TC group and it wasn't great. So what are some warning signs to look for in transaction coordinators where you say, I don't think I want to go with them. I'm going to go a different direction?
Yeah, I will give you a real life example. So because this is another thing, is I teach from the role of I'm an operator within an investor's business. So I do have the view of an investor in particular because I am PACE in many of these scenarios. I'm a manager on pretty much all of his entities. So I sit in his place as the investor in the transaction on many occasions. So we had a transaction brought to us where PACE was the end buyer, or the entity that I was a manager on was the end buyer. And there was a TC already on the deal. And in the first introduction email to the attorney, the TC was doing their job. They were doing their due diligence, combining everybody into one email. But what I don't like about that interaction is that I was never introduced formally for me to hire the TC as the end buyer, right? Meanwhile, I have my own TC team. So this is even harder for us, right? Because I'm like, okay, I want to keep you involved for your client's perspective, for them to have eyeballs on the transaction, but I don't necessarily need you to do everything on my behalf, because I have my own processes and ways. And so just for all of you here that have worked with wholesalers and you've been the TC on the wholesaler side, this is my perspective coming in from the end buyer side, is I felt like, okay, there's an assumption here that you're going to continue to work for me. And I'm okay looping you in, but I'm going to set some boundaries up front and say, hey, by the way, my team will be TCing our side, and this will be the TC for the original buyer, and they'll be keeping track for us. But thank you for this introduction, right? But within that introduction, in addition to me feeling like, hey, I didn't hire you, the second part was they were asking whether they should draft the legal documents, the promissory note, the deed of trust, the warranty deed. The TC was asking that. And so very quickly I said, hey, you're talking to an attorney. The attorney is being hired to do that. What would be the reason you would need to do that? And the response was, oh, well, I've asked other attorneys in the past and they said that they would prefer me to do it. And I was like, okay, well, that's probably because now they're not legally responsible for those documents because you drafted them. And so now not only are you paying them their full fee, right, but you're not asking them to draft the things that they could potentially be liable for in the future. And if you think they're going to stick their neck out for you and put their malpractice or errors and omissions on the line for those documents in the future, if something goes wrong, you will be sorely upset because there is no way. So that is one of those things, you guys, if you feel like, and this is I don't know where it comes from, Sean. I feel like maybe sometimes people, because they know, they think they should just do.
Mm-hmm.
And because they feel like there have been times in the past where they maybe knew a little bit more than an attorney did about creative transactions specifically. And this is something I run into all the time, where the title company or the attorney may contact me and say, hey, we haven't done a bunch of these. Can you send me examples of other types of transactions? Maybe your closing packets for those, and we can look at what types of documents were drafted. Absolutely. I will go that far, but I'm not going to say, let me draft those for you. You don't know what you're doing. Let me draft those for you. Never would I ever do that. So that's a big red flag for me.
So let's talk about those roles. So we've kind of broken down what a transaction coordinator, does. And you used a nanny example. I've sometimes referred to him as, the person who shepherds the transaction or quarterbacks the transaction. But let's break down the different professionals involved in the transaction. So you can have, your investors or not even investors. You have your seller, your buyer. You have sometimes your real estate agent. You have your title company if it's in Arizona, potentially an attorney, depending on the nature of the transaction in Arizona or elsewhere. And then you have, your transaction coordinator. So let's just start with, say, a real estate broker as opposed to a transaction coordinator. What roles do they play in the transaction?
So that's the switch I made, right? And so it's a very careful balance, because I always have to think of, if I was an agent, would this imply agency? Would what I'm doing right now imply that I am somebody's agent? And so I think I see that from a different perspective from somebody who doesn't have previous traditional real estate experience. But an agent or a broker in a transaction has a license, and once again, the insurances, to actually broker a transaction, to introduce a buyer and a seller, or help a seller find a buyer. They have the licenses to do that, and they've partnered with the appropriate associations in the country and in their state in order to do that. When a broker or a real estate agent comes into a transaction, they have a fiduciary responsibility. They have a different level of responsibility for their clients, and they know that, right? That's why when investors come and they want to talk directly to sellers and the agents won't let them talk directly to sellers, they're like, the investors don't understand. Why would they not let me talk to their seller? Because that's their responsibility. They have a responsibility legally, contractually, to protect their client from any sort of communication that would not be filtered through them first. And if they don't do that, they're not upholding what they're legally supposed to be doing for their client. It's like the other day, somebody called Sean St. Clair's office on behalf of one of our properties, and Sean didn't say anything to them. They were inquiring about things, and Sean said, I will give your information to them. They can reach out to you. Same thing with agents, right? They are there to protect their clients from any sort of potential fraudulent activity or anything. And so you, as an investor coming in, asking questions about their client's situation, they should be able to answer those questions, in their opinion, without their client involved. There shouldn't need to be their client involved. That's why their client hired them. So there's a difference in that relationship, because there's a level of responsibility that's much higher than it would be for a transaction coordinator or even a title and escrow company, right? Other people involved in the transaction don't have that much responsibility associated with the client they're contracted with. And so I always try and think of that when I am TCing deals is, okay, I have a client asking me a question that as an agent, I would probably feel comfortable answering, but I'm not their agent. So what is the appropriate thing for me to do here? The appropriate thing for me to do is to say, hey, I cannot give you legal advice. I'm also not your real estate agent, so I can't particularly do that. If you have a real estate agent, you need to go reference them for that question, or I'd be happy to introduce you to an attorney, right? Which is so annoying for people. I know it's annoying. I know people think I'm so annoying when I do that, but the problem without doing it is, and I have done it, I have given people a very quick response to something before, and it has come back and bit me in the butt, you guys, because then they would come back and they'll say, hey, I asked you this question a couple months ago, and now I'm talking to an attorney, and an attorney's saying, and I'm like, okay, I should have never. So my response always is, hey, I honestly was just trying to be helpful. I'm not an attorney in your state. You probably knew that when you contacted me. So I would listen to your attorney, right? Like, don't come back to me and be like, I want to listen to you over them. You listen to your attorney. Don't listen to me. You know,
So, and as far as drafting contracts too, brokers have the ability under their licenses to draft contracts for transactions that they're involved in. They can't independently draft contracts if they're not otherwise involved.
In some states,
brokering it.
Right? In some states, they don't, like New York.
Yeah.
That's an attorney state. The attorney would draft all the documents there. So
Right.
that's something else that it's like across the board. There's not even this is something so important for you guys to listen to. There is no standard, like from state to state. There is nothing that is the same. And that's the hardest part about doing national real estate, and the hardest part about being a TC that's national is that you may have not worked in these particular states and you understand how it works in a different state, or maybe you've done a transaction where you know what they did in that scenario for that state, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be appropriate in the state they're in. So referencing the professionals that work in that particular state is so important, right? Whether it's a real estate broker and they draft documents or whatever, or whether it's a closing attorney or a real estate attorney in general, that's going to be something I always recommend. And like I just said, it is annoying sometimes because people will be like, well, you should know. And like, haven't you done this before? Well, it's not the same from state to state. And I'm not licensed to do what you're asking me to do.
Right. Well, and that's the point. And I think this is the second time that I've gotten that wrong, where I talked about brokers drafting contracts. And you've corrected me both times. So thank you. But, I come from the Arizona, the West Coast perspective, and that's just what they do in that part of the country. But the East Coast is a whole different animal sometimes.
Well, even you, Sean, you're not redrafting a brand new document every time somebody asks you to draft a contract, right? You have some general blanket disclosures, and then you add customized disclosures within there and the data that's for the terms of that transaction. But even you as an attorney, you're filling in a pre-filled form. Yes, it's a form you created. And so a real estate agent is licensed to do that here in many states, right? They are licensed to fill out pre-filled, fillable forms that are made for their state specifically. But so is an attorney. So I think this is a differentiation that people don't make. Like, I'll have clients come to me and say, well, you're not drafting the contract. You're just filling in the blanks. And my response always is, so is an attorney. They're usually not drafting a completely new document for you. They're filling in the blanks of a document. And then they're thinking about, legal cases that they've heard of where they should add some disclosures and some preventative things. And they're adding in additional disclosures in a way that they feel like prevents those things that they've heard of from happening in this specific transaction. And that also happens every single time a client asks a TC to fill out a contract. They always say, oh, well, this section, I didn't really know what to say, but you know what I'm trying to do, fill it out, right? And it's like, no, because then you're asking me to draft a disclosure for your transaction, which is definitely something an attorney should be doing for you, because I don't have the knowledge of the laws or the case law that's happened here where I can reference cases where I know that I'm specifically putting in a disclosure that's appropriate for this state. I don't know any of that. There's no reason for me to draft that. So if you want to do it yourself and you're holding the responsibility for it, absolutely, you can do that, right? You can do it yourself and you can fill it out on your own behalf. If I read it and it makes sense to me, I'm just going to say, yeah, it makes sense. I can relay this to the title company or the closing attorney. And that's what my role is.
Right. Now, talking about title companies. So, you either have title companies or closing attorneys. So in Arizona, we have title companies. In other states, you're going to have closing attorneys. Talk to us about the role of the title company / closing attorney as opposed to a transaction coordinator. What will the title company or closing attorney do, and as opposed to the transaction coordinator?
Yeah. And bless their heart, title companies get asked to do things that would be much better suited for a transaction coordinator all the time. For example, when I first came into Pace's wholesale business, the main like sales guy that we had that was out getting contracts would just drop the contract off at the title company's office. What I want you guys to know about that is if there's nobody holding on to a version of that within their own team, how are you keeping your document? How are you you don't have appropriate files. You don't have appropriate record keeping at that point. So if you were ever asked at any point in time to provide your documents, they would say, oh, well, I dropped those off with the title company. I mean, I can call the title company, but now you're using your title company as you would be using a transaction coordinator or somebody that's administratively looking out for you in your record keeping, right? So number one, the title company shouldn't be keeping your records for you. You shouldn't be relying on them to keep records for you. You should be keeping your own set of records. So in addition to your contracts and then the title report or commitment that they provide, all of that should be being kept and held within your own document, whether it's Dropbox, Google Drive, whatever document platform you're using to hold those documents. You should be keeping those and the physical versions. This is another thing that I feel like a lot of investors do. They don't keep the final closing packets for anything. There wasn't a filing cabinet to be found when I first got into Pace's world, right? And so I was like, like my brain's going to explode. How are you keeping documentation for anything? And so that's number one, something a transaction coordinator is going to do for you is they're going to help you provide that documentation if it's ever needed in the future, because they're going to have a clear, organized file of everything that happened and was executed during that transaction. That's not your title company's role. So your title company is not going to keep your documents for you. They may have records of things and some of the things they worked with, but they won't have everything, right? And they shouldn't be expected to keep everything for you. So that's the first mistake I've seen investors make with title companies. But in addition to that, they're just there to be a neutral third party. There's somebody that's in the transaction saying, hey, we don't represent anyone, right? We don't work for you or you. We're a neutral third party. We're associated with an escrow company that holds your earnest money deposit. And we just sit here and say, okay, you give us your documents. You give us your documents. We'll schedule signings for things. We'll make sure you get a title commitment with insurance if it's allowable in this transaction. And we'll relay the information about that title policy or the title report, whatever they may find. But that's really all I'm using that title company for, right? I don't want to push them past that point and have them draft addendums, or they'll sometimes I'll have investors that are asking title companies to draft new documents, and all kinds of things. And sometimes they have an attorney on staff that will do those things, but not all the time. So it shouldn't be expected in every scenario.
So as far as a drafting perspective, generally the title company, they're going to draft the deed. So the conveyance document. Yeah. If it is say a wrap financing transaction with like a performance note or deed of trust, most of the time the title companies will do that, and then the settlement statement, but pretty much that's the extent of their drafting, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I don't really see, every once in a while, especially here in Arizona, we'll have title companies that are okay with doing like the agreement for sale documents because that's the only way they'll close particularly types of transactions. But in other states, I don't have that. This is just an Arizona thing. Like in other states, many times I have to go employ an attorney to draft that document because it is a legal document that gets recorded. It's it's an installment contract of some kind. It's not the same as a warranty deed or a promissory note and deed of trust that can be templated and filled in like a title company would for those things.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really depends on the nature and structure of the transaction as to, whether to bring an attorney in or, just process it through a title company. So let's talk. You mentioned communication, and you even gave the example of having multiple TCs involved. And I will tell you, I was dragged into a transaction where there were multiple TCs involved, and both TCs were trying to, run the transaction.
Yeah. And
I ended up on the email chain, and I was pulling my hair out because I was getting 10 to 15 emails a day, and it was frankly overwhelming. And because of that, the transaction was not processed as efficiently or effectively as I thought it could have been. So talk to me about how to effectively communicate with the TC, number one, and how TC should effectively communicate with the players in the transaction?
This is my opinion, and everyone has a different opinion. But for me, when someone hires a TC, they're hiring them to babysit their kid, right? And so if all of a sudden your neighbor comes over and brings their kids over, it's not automatically assumed that that person should be babysitting all the kids, right? And so what I said in the beginning was I like to think of TCs as representing or working for the person who originally hired them, the person who should have a signed service agreement with you and a deposit. That's who you work for. If someone doesn't have a signed service agreement with you or a deposit, you don't work for them. And so this is really difficult in wholesale scenarios because the TC who starts the deal is usually assumed to be the TC who ends the deal, which can be fine. But in scenarios like what you're talking about and what I was talking about, where the end buyer brings in their own TC, there needs to be a clear handoff, right? Like, hey, I'm still here. I would like to be included on all of the emails, but this is now yours. My shift is over. So I'm going to still be here and I will know what's going on. And I would like to still see the settlement statement. I would like to still make sure my client is getting what they need out of this transaction. And I can still report to them on what they need as the wholesaler in the transaction. But as the end buyer, this is now your transaction. You're the transaction coordination team on this. And I will just sit back and watch, right? When that doesn't happen, exactly what you're talking about is what occurs. There's too many cooks in the kitchen. Everyone's trying to cook the same soup. And it's all of a sudden you're like, holy crap, this isn't even soup anymore. It's just a mess. What is going on? So it's very, very, very important to not, and TCs tend to have personality types. I will say I've been this way before, that they want to have control over it because they feel they know how to do it the right way and they want to be involved and they want to be the most up to date. But just really sitting back and saying, okay, this is no longer my client's transaction. It is because they wholesaled it, but contractually, they're not buying it anymore. So the person who is sitting there working for the TC that's working for the end buyer should be in charge from here on out for the information that's needed for closing. And if I now go and insert myself, it's probably going to create confusion, And so that is a really hard thing. One of my right hand, Ashley Mason, one of the first times I ever worked with her was on a transaction just like that. She was the first buyer's TC, and then we came in and actually partnered with that buyer and became a second buyer. So now we had two buyers on one transaction. And so the first thing I did is I said, do you have a TC to this first buyer? And he said, yes, I do. It's Ashley Mason. And I was like, yes, great. So I reach out to her. I knew nothing. I didn't even need to talk to him anymore. Right. Mm-hmm. So I reach out to her and I'm like, send me all of the documents you have up until now and give me a play-by-play of what's happened, right? Where are you at right now? Okay, great. Thank you for sending me all these things. Here's what I communicated back. Here's what I'm planning to do next. If you want to loop me in, now I have her introduce me to the transaction as the new TC that's working with the other buyer. I'll run point from here on out, right? Because we had some particular things we needed for our partnership that we were doing with them. I said, I'll run point and I'll just work with you on the side, but I don't need you to communicate with title or do any of that stuff. When I did need her to communicate with title, she would, and then she'd come back to me and report with me. It was never us both simultaneously doing it. It was me communicating with her or her communicating with me and us delegating what needed to be done in the transaction. And it really created a partnership and a team that obviously I then couldn't let go because now she works for me. And you guys, it would be so beneficial to all of you as TCs to be able to create those relationships and really use that for the strength that it is, because it's actually somebody to delegate things to, because they still have some responsibility in the transaction. So if you're like, hey, I'm really busy, I got a lot of files going on, I need to check in on this. Can you call the closing attorney and just ask this question and report back to me? Sure, great, I'll get it, And so you just need to make sure that you're communicating appropriately with all parties, including another TC, and seeing them as the other part of the transaction and making sure you both are on the same page of how you're going to work it together.
Yeah, I love the idea of having that point person, even if you have multiple TCs or, maybe a TC group has multiple employees, but having that one central point of communication is so helpful. I'm curious your thoughts on this, and this is one of my pet peeves, in working real estate transactions or just anything with clients or TCs or anyone else. But, our engagement letter or my communication will be, okay, when do you need this by? Okay, I will provide it to you by this date. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of people become uncomfortable or anxious with days going by when you have a pending transaction where it's like, I haven't heard anything, like, is this going to close or this or that? Even though it's well within the time period that, the other professionals have said, they're going to deliver this stuff. And then they start, what's the status? What's the ETA? It drives me crazy. What do you, talk to your students about on those types of issues? Because I get it. I have the same thing on when transactions I'm involved in where I don't hear anything for a couple of days. I'm like, oh shoot, is this, on track, and yeah. So I get that, pit of the stomach type thing where I feel the need to reach out. And sometimes I will, if I don't have a set deadline, but if I'm like, oh no, they're going to get to me by this date, and I don't mind people reaching out after if you blow the deadline, but it drives me crazy to reach out before because it's just another email. It's another phone call. It's another thing I have to deal with that takes me away from getting the work done.
And that's really hard, right? Because every real estate transaction has that lull period. Mm-hmm. It's that period of time where it feels like nothing's happening, right? Where in a traditional real estate transaction, it's usually your inspection period. Inspections are going on. You're waiting for that impending Binzer report to come in. You don't know if they're going to want a bunch of repairs. And then once then there's another lull where you're fixing those things and there's nobody really reporting back until all of those things are done. And then next thing you know, it's closing, right? And everybody's rush, and you're trying to close. So that's a typical feeling. There's a couple of lull periods within a transaction, but we work with so many people who are either new to transactions or they just are nervous because of the specific type of transaction it is. And they just don't know, especially sometimes sellers, I feel like when they're selling their property subject to or in a creative finance way, they're like, I don't know, this is weird, right? And so they may be reaching out. Once again, this is a good reason to have a TC because then you're not bothering the attorney. Your TC should be pinging in with you. And I do teach my top tier TCs to have a upfront expectation of how often you're going to communicate. In the beginning, it may not be daily, right? So you'll have a lot of communication right at the beginning. You'll have a lot of communication right at the end. And if there's events that happen throughout, you'll communicate during those periods of time. But you may be getting an update every few days in the first couple of weeks. If you have a standard 30 to 45 day closing period, you're getting an update every couple of days. You're not getting an update every single day. Now, some TCs have that time and they are giving an update every single day, but that's not something you as an attorney, Sean, would typically be doing, sending out an email to all of your clients every day to say, this is where we are. No, that's not going to happen. So, and I wouldn't even reach out to, so say we were closing a transaction with you, we would know what's happening with it. And we know what's normal because we've done more with you. So if we have a client who's never done a transaction with you, they could reach out to us and they could talk to us if they had any questions. But in the meantime, I would be sending communication like, hey, we're just waiting on a title report from the title company we've contracted with outside of Sean St. Clair. As soon as we get that title report, we'll let you know what's going on with it. We'll send it over to you. If there's anything that Sean needs to do regarding that title report, we'll reach out to Sean. But otherwise, we're just kind of in this holding period. I expect it to be a few more days, right? And just that's what a TC does. Right? Not an attorney, right? That's not typical, I think, for you guys to do that.
Right. So let's talk about close of escrow dates. So if you have an investor and they're going to want to use you or a top tier TC student, and they want to know, okay, how quickly can this close? Mm-hmm. Or what would you prefer on a close of escrow date as far as, being able to get all the ducks in a line and close the transaction effectively without it being chaotic? What would your answer to them be?
Standard is 30 days. That's what I always teach all of my students. Standard is 30 days. A creative transaction typically goes over, you guys. I mean, honestly, there's just I would say 75% of the time they go over their closing date because they have something that comes up, whether it's situational for them, the seller specifically, or whether it's funding wise, or whether it's a title report issue. I'm typically seeing those go over an average of a week to 2 weeks from their closing date. That is normal. So people who are closing creative finance transactions, I would say a 45-day close just to be safe. And you can close before that is safe for me. It feels like everybody has wiggle room to do their job appropriately. Title, attorney, TC, buyer, seller, everybody has the appropriate amount of time. And that's why standard closing times for traditional transactions is about 30 days. I know a lot of investors like to use that as a negotiation point where they're like, I can close in 3 days. Well, when I have a client that comes to me and says, I told the seller I'd close in 3 days, I say, well, where's your title report? And have you worked with an attorney or this title company that says they can actually make that happen? Because it's not up to me as the TC. It's going to be up to them. And so that's the first communication I would have. I'd say, hey, Sean, we have a client who just brought us a contract that says they can close this in 3 days. Can you do that? And what would you say?
Potentially. I mean, and that's the thing. There's other third-party factors as well. So assuming you have the title commitment and the mortgage statement and you have everything in line, that's great. But what if it's in an HOA? Well, we're not getting the HOA documents in that amount of time. And so you have to deal with that. And so there's other factors, but I mean, we do, if it's like that time period and everything's in order, we can do that. We charge more to do it, but we can do it, assuming we don't have to rely upon third parties in those types of, timeframes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's working with an attorney, guys. Most of the time, if I'm going to call a title company, they're going to be like, especially on the East Coast title companies, I'm missing like 2 weeks out of the transaction. Like sometimes it takes them 10 days to get me a title report.
Right.
And I think it's just because it's a more populated part of the country. They have a lot more title reports being ran at the same time. And it is a manual process, guys. It's not a magic, like poof, you get a title report. Somebody's manually doing that search for you. So it takes time and it takes manpower to get it done. And so if someone's coming to me, especially on the East Coast, and they're saying, hey, I want to close this in 5 days, I'm going to say, hey, well, you're not going to close it with a title report. You're definitely not going to get title insurance. And I mean, good luck, right? Like we can try, but it's very, very, very unlikely.
Right. And the problem with that too is obviously the contract has a cure notice and that type of thing. But if you lock that in and, the seller gets impatient and cures and you're still waiting on the title company, you may end up, without a contract at that point. So it really is good to set the seller expectations. Plus, you don't want an upset seller. I mean, we've seen that. It's never a comfortable thing. There's always threats and things that aren't being made. And you would rather just be smooth and you set the seller expectations properly so that they really know, okay, this is realistically what we're going to do as far as closing. So, well, Molly, thank you so much for being with us today. This was great. I really enjoyed being able to discuss this topic with you. And thanks for taking the time to be here. Where can our listeners find you?
So I will say, you guys, because I am so busy operationally, and Sean, I don't know how you maintain any sort of presence like social media wise or anything like that, but I do have our business pages. So TopTier TC, Instagram, Facebook. We also have TopTierTC.com if you are interested in the course itself. And then we have Pace's free Facebook group that I will always plug because that's where you can go and network with people, which is the Creative Finance with Pace Morby Facebook group. Personally, I don't really have a whole bunch of social media presence. The marketing team for Top Tier is working on that for me. But Top Tier TC as well, you can find on Instagram and all the other socials, and then our website.
Great. Well, reach out to Molly, connect with her, find out more about her training program. Thanks again. We appreciate you being on.
Thank you so much. I always love doing these with you.
All right, Molly, have a great day. Well, that's the end of our show today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please tune in today for the Creative Finance Collective at 2:00 Arizona time. And then tune in next week for another episode of the INRIM podcast. Have a good day, everyone.